Good afternoon, Lavilla. This is one of my lecture series that I started due to this remote teaching. As we start week 6, I think this is probably my 6th lecture. And, I just want you to know I miss you guys. And this is kind of my way to help sort things out. I've been facing challenges during this time, and I'm sure all of you guys are too. And so this has been my therapy. A lot of times they say when you need therapy, go to your instrument and play, and that helps kind of distract you from what's going on. In these lectures, I have been talking a lot about how important it is to be curious about music and to listen to great recordings and to read books about music or go online and read articles about music, about different composers, about different time periods. And I've been talking a lot about practicing and how to practice efficiently and how to set goals and strategies. Today, I'm going to kind of delve a little bit further into that. I talk about how important it is to read books. I love reading books about making myself better as a musician, as a performer, in history. And so I actually, here's Marcel. I don't know if you can see Marcel. Do you want to say hi, Marcel? He's watching our lecture today too. This is Marcel. I think this is where he likes to take his nap. Anyhow, I have lots of books. There have been lots of books written on the topic of how to practice. And the reason we have so many books is because people say it differently. They might be saying the exact same thing, but sometimes if somebody says it a little bit differently, it helps make it click for you. So 3 books that I'm going to kind of recommend to you that I've read and I find very interesting. This is probably the easiest one to understand, and it's applicable, especially for young students. It's called Practicing Successfully, a Masterclass in the Musical Art. And it's by Elizabeth Green. Another book that I really liked is a book by Cornelia Watkins and Laurie Scott. And it's called From the Stage to the Studio, How Fine Musicians Become Great Teachers. And it really talks about how you as a player can become a great teacher, not only for yourself, but for other students. Or when you get older, when you become teachers, for your students. And then the third book that I'm talking about today, I have a whole rack of books that I could use, is called The Musician's Way. And this is by Gerald Klickstein, and it's a guide to practice, performance, and wellness. And a lot of my material from today comes from this book. Wellness is really important, and that's what I was trying to talk about. When we do our Wednesday wellness sessions, I'm going to be doing another video where I talk a little bit about structuring your time, setting goals during this uncertain time. So that'll be in my next series. So practicing, the title of my presentation today is called Practicing Deeply. And that is a quote from that book, The Musician's Way. Practice is your quest for artistic growth. And if you practice in an unfocused way and you have a lack of attention to detail, then your performance will be uninspired, lack the musical qualities of the work. It's very important that when you're practicing, you're imagining yourself in performance and practicing with the same kind of focus. When you practice deeply, you explore all aspects of the music. Every element in the music should draw your interest so that you can project that out to your audience or to your listener. Along with exploring all aspects of the music. You know, in our master classes, I've been talking about, okay, when did that composer live? What were his dates? Who were some other composers that wrote at the same time? What instruments were being developed at that time? Just this morning, I was talking about Bach, and the students told me what the metronome marking was. But of course, you've got to know that the metronome hadn't been invented yet. So Bach did not write that. Somebody that performed it and interpreted it decided, oh, this would be a good tempo. So it's important to know those kind of things. As a student, you need to develop habits of excellence to promote your artistic independence and to shape your own creativity and musical development. And these habits are what are going to guide you on your quest for becoming a great musician or an artist, or even if you do something completely different from music, these habits will affect your life. Your habits in the practice room can make you the musician that you want to be. Your practice must instill the habits that you will need on stage. What you do in the practice room is what you will do in the performance. And I say that a lot in rehearsal. You think that, you could be practicing something and you'll think, oh, I just can't quite do it, or you'll play it one way. If you practice it incorrectly and not at the highest level, you're not suddenly going to be able to do it in performance. So you have to work your way into the appropriate kind of practice with the appropriate sound and the appropriate focus. If in your practice your mind is wandering, or for example in rehearsal you're not paying attention to what's going on around you, that will transfer into your performance. And those are habits that we want to make sure you focus on developing appropriately. I have 7 habits that we're going to talk about today in this little lecture that are important for your success as a musician, performer, and person. The poet John Dryden said, "We first must make our habits, and then our habits make us." And although I'm talking about habits of excellence in music, all of these habits will transfer into your personal life. So the first habit, I'll give you the 7 that I'm going to talk about, is playing with ease. Making it look easy when you play. Paying attention to your posture. Being relaxed. Not doing too much movement, or making sure the movement doesn't distract from the music. Number 2, playing with expressiveness in practice. There are theories of how to practice a piece of music. Some people say, well, first I'm going to learn the rhythms, then I'm going to learn the notes, then I'm going to learn the dynamics, then I'm going to learn the phrasing, and they kind of compartmentalize everything. I like to always try and bring that expressiveness into the beginning stages of learning a piece of music. Not to compartmentalize, but to put it all together. Play with accuracy. One of my favorite lines is never play it wrong. So that might mean you have to slow tempos down in order to play rhythmically correct and technically correct, dynamically correct. So always play with accuracy, because each time you play something and you have mistakes, you're building those mistakes into your performance. And it will be difficult to break those habits. It takes a lot more time to break a habit than it does to create a habit. Play with rhythmic vitality. In all of our master classes, we've been talking about pulse and rhythm. And when I talked about John Delancey earlier on, we talked about how students aren't always paying attention to how to read the music accurately. And that includes all aspects of the music. Reading the rhythms correctly, reading the dynamics correctly, understanding the articulations and the phrasings. So rhythmic vitality. Always play with a beautiful tone and pitch center. You know, you might think, oh, I'm just practicing. It doesn't matter what I sound like. Well, as soon as you start sacrificing your sound in practice, it will transfer into performance. So always make sure in your practice, you're focused on creating the most beautiful sound that you can have and staying at pitch center. If you play 20 cent sharp all the time, you start to think that that's correct, and you always will play 20 cent sharp. However, when you're playing with a piano or playing in an ensemble and you're playing 20 cent sharp, it's not going to sound good. So make sure you're paying attention to pitch center. Practice with focused attention. And I used to be guilty of this, and I know other people that have done this too. When I'm practicing something like scales or something kind of routine, I stop thinking about what I'm doing and I just go through the motions. Well, that's developing bad habits, because all music is made up of basically scales and intervals. And if you're practicing those scales or those intervals without intention, that's how you'll play it when you approach those places in your music. And the 7th habit that I'm going to talk about is to maintain a positive attitude. You can be your own worst enemy or your biggest cheerleader, and that makes a big difference in your performance. So the first habit that I talked about is the ease of playing. All masterful performers exhibit an ease in what they do on stage, because in practice, they play with ease. And they even imagine how they want to look on stage. You know, how do you talk to the audience? They imagine how to do those kind of things to make it normal and to make it comfortable. Always build awareness, and I'm guilty of this. Build awareness of your posture, your movement, your hand position, your embouchure. Make sure you try to avoid tension. I say often, make it look easy. No matter how hard it is, make it look easy. One way you can make your performance look easy is to make sure you have a solid grasp on your music, both technically and musically. Poor preparation in that area only causes you to be anxious and have more tension. And there are tons of books written about performance anxiety for that reason. I think the best way to conquer performance anxiety is to make sure you're very, very comfortable with the music that you're playing. The key to easeful performance is the ability to command your performance with confidence. You're in charge of what's coming out of your instrument, not your instrument being in charge of what plays. And on all instruments, you have some notes that come out easier, some notes that are hard to get out. So you have to focus on those notes that are more difficult to get out, to get to sing. To foster these easeful habits, I think it's important to choose manageable literature. You know, we all want to play that hardest piece of music, or maybe we don't all want to do that, because some people choose literature that is maybe too easy for them. It's a fine line. I want you to push yourself. I want you to challenge yourself to play music that's going to make you better, that's going to move you forward in your playing. But I don't want you to choose music that you have to just white knuckle. You have to really spend more time practicing the technique than being able to put the music and the technique together. Choose manageable literature, something that's going to challenge you, but still something that you could probably be able to play in a couple of weeks. Always practice at a tempo where you do not struggle. And that goes with my never play it wrong. Use the metronome to help keep you practicing at a slower pace so that you're not playing along and then you have hesitations. we've been talking about that in the master classes, where students will play along and then they get to a place where it's a little more challenging, and then they start to hesitate, or they're not keeping the rhythmic pulse going. So make sure you always play at a tempo where you can play with accuracy, with precision, with correct rhythms, and you're not slowing down to accommodate trills or turns or the technique. I already talked about this a little bit. As a player, I've spent hours drilling technique, trying to get certain passages exactly right. And actually my husband noticed this one time, and he said, you know what? Stop thinking about the technique and start thinking about the music. And I thought about that for a minute. And so instead of thinking about the technique, I thought about the line, and I was really surprised that the technique fell into place. When I stopped focusing on it, it just kind of happened. Now, part of that was because I spent so much time working on it. You have to have a certain amount of technique. But once I quit focusing on it and I just kind of let my fingers do it, it fell right together. So always kind of keep those together, the musical line and the technique, and I think that'll help you. With as much recording devices as you guys have, you should record yourself daily. And the way I do this in my practice is I'll just record a very short section, maybe, a couple of lines of a piece of music that I'm working on. And I'll listen to that because I don't want to spend my whole practice time listening to my recordings. So I might play about 2 minutes of excerpt, and then I'll go back and I'll listen to it, and I'll make corrections on what I want to fix, and then I'll record it again, and then I'll listen to it again, and I'll see, okay, did I make those corrections? Did it get better? And so that's kind of you go back and forth, but you just do shorter little segments to evaluate that. And things you can listen to when you're recording are, how are you articulating? Is it a light articulation? Is it heavy? Most of the things that I've been talking about in master classes, I think you could fix yourself if you recorded yourself and listened carefully to it. If you can videotape yourself, that's great. In my studio, I have a full-length mirror. And so often I stand in front of the mirror when I'm practicing so I can pay attention to what I'm doing. All of these habits I'm working on trying to improve. And so, I'm not telling you anything that I'm not doing myself. So the second point that I made is to always play with expressiveness. The only way you can become an expressive performer is to be an expressive practicer. In talking about listening to recordings, I often say, you've heard me say it before, the only way you can be a great musician is by listening to great musicians. To really focus on listening to great musicians, or great orchestras, or great bands, or great choirs, or a soprano. Listening to all sorts of music and listening to what they do musically. For myself, I often, when I was young and I was learning how to play with vibrato, I would look at the string players because it's a visual. You can see the string players making vibrato, and I would try to imitate that with my wind. And so always work on, I already talked about making, I'm coming up, a beautiful sound, but playing with expressiveness. Bring out the peaks of phrases and then come on back down. Figure out where your phrasing is going to be. Figure out your breathing and then do it. A lot of times I'll hear students that just play until they run out of breath, and that doesn't work with the phrasing of the piece. So know the phrasing of the piece, incorporate your breathing so that it's part of the music, not just, oh my gosh, I need a breath right now. We've been talking in our classes about strong beats and weak beats and playing with inflection. We talked about, for example, in 3/4 time, 1 would be the stronger beat, 3 would be a secondary strong beat, 2 would be the weakest. So you'd have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Or in 4/4 time, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 and 3 would be the strong beats. 2 and 4 would be the secondary beats. Use your imagination with everything that you're playing. Again, my husband used to talk about probing the music. Explore, do different things. You might do things completely different from what you would do in performance, but explore to find out what you like. And then again, record yourself and see, how did that work? You know, a common concept is if you're ascending, if you're going up the scale to crescendo, and if you're descending, coming down the scale to diminuendo, do the opposite. Diminuendo going up the scale, crescendo coming down the scale, and that brings a whole new life to your musical interpretation. Use your imagination. Think about what the music is trying to say, how the music is trying to say it, and play that through your instrument. Wynton Marsalis, this is a quote by Wynton Marsalis, but it's something I've said all the time. I just didn't know who quoted it. He says to play scales and etudes with line and shape. Treat everything you play on your instrument as an important piece of music, especially when you are just warming up. You know, sometimes I'll hear kids warming up and they're just blatting on their instrument. They're not using a good sound. They're playing high, loud, fast, whatever they're trying to do. And it's so important that every time you put that instrument to your face, that you are working to create the best sound that you can and play the most musically that you can. So rhythmic vitality has been a topic of conversation in all of our master classes. I talked about how John Delancey says, and I'll say it again, music exists in time. So musicians must always have a high awareness of timing. And that's something that teachers talk about all the time, is students are losing that sense of pulse. And it's important to make sure you can internalize that pulse. I talked about using the metronome and subdividing, so having the eighth notes playing on the metronome, and that helps line things up. But then have just the quarter note, and then eventually put the half note and see if you can maintain that sense of internal pulse and stay with the metronome by maintaining that pulse. Artistic timing isn't only about maintaining the steady pulse and precisely dividing the subdivisions. It is also, about having that inflection, the punctuation, like Delancey talked about, the comma, the period, the exclamation mark. Making music is much like grammar. If you think about the note is equal to a word, and then you tie those notes together and you might create a phrase, and then you tie those phrases together and you'll create a sentence, and then put those sentences together, you create a paragraph, and then a chapter, and then a book. So if you can think about music in that same sense when you're playing a concerto, for an example, think about tying those notes together as though it were grammar. Think of music with grammatical punctuation. Vitality in rhythm results when you create the forward motion that propels a phrase towards that punctuation. Again, in our classes, we've been talking about playing across the bar line. And in one of my first lectures, I talked about how often I hear students that just kind of stop at the bar line. They don't quite get across. And so I had an exercise in that first lecture helping you to think about going across the bar. And so that is very, very important. Keep the motion propelling forward. The next topic is playing with a beautiful tone. The quality of your tone will have more of an impact on the listener than any other aspect of your playing. Think about that for a minute. The first thing And what people are listening to while you're playing is your sound, your tone quality. If you have a harsh tone, even if you execute everything perfectly, the performance will be uninspiring. People don't want to listen to a harsh sound quality or tone. Your tone needs to entice your listeners, captivate your audience. And you do that through the sound quality, but also through dynamic range. Remember, John Delancey talked about how we don't use enough of our dynamic range. We don't really play soft. We don't really play loud. We kind of stay within that mezzo range. So really draw in your audience by how softly can you play that phrase? How full can you make that line, but still have a good sound? Whenever you practice, always ensure that your tone is full and rich and that you have accurate pitch center. And a lot of times with young musicians, especially if you think about when you were in 6th grade, how you would just stick the instrument up to your mouth and start playing without thinking about what's coming out of the instrument, what kind of sound. And so that's something the habit that I want you to develop is to always listen to what is coming out of your instrument. The next point was focused attention. And I remember when I was young, I used to have this problem when I was practicing. I would be thinking about other things. And I used to tell myself, I got to focus. I got to stay focused. It's important. I developed that habit, but it's really, really important. Imagine yourself when you're walking out on stage getting ready to perform. Okay? You probably have a higher level of focus at that time than you do in a practice room. But if you are developing those habits in your practice room, it won't be that much different. So when you walk out on stage, you can perform and be focused and have the confidence that you need. Disciplined mental habits in practice will lay the groundwork for your performance. In contrast, if you practice with a lack of focus, you will perform with a lack of focus. Things are not going to change just because you walk out on stage. To cultivate focused practice and mental habits, make sure you're setting specific goals and strategies. Avoid doing mindless repetition. You know, there are times where you have to do repetition to build it in, but you want to eventually move away from that so that it's just not a machine. Doesn't sound like a machine. And that goes back into the idea of choosing literature that is attainable within a certain period of time, so you're not playing stressed. That last topic that I wanted to talk about is maintaining a positive attitude. And I've had students that are kind of self-defeating. You know, they are always negative on themselves. They're down on themselves, which means that they're not going to get any better. I read a book a long time ago, probably 30 years ago, talking about the power of positive thinking. Your mental mind state, your positive attitude can take you a long ways. Some artistic and technical problems will be easy to figure out. Others will be very challenging, and each person is an individual. For some people, they might be able to do something immediately, where this other person needs to work really hard to get to the same spot. Always keep a positive attitude. Keep it attainable. Practice, do things slowly so that you can feel some accomplishment. Meet your challenges head on, which will make you stronger and more confident in the end. And I always talk about how I like living on the edge. I like pushing myself as hard as I can push myself. And I think that's important. For me, it's important. It might not be important for everybody. But if you, as I say, live on the edge, you'll open up a whole new world of things that you'll be able to do. If you always want to play it safe, you really won't go anywhere. You'll just stay in your little box. So always view those challenges as opportunities for learning, as opportunities at becoming better. Remain optimistic. Negative thoughts are our own worst enemy, as our positive thoughts can be very helpful to us. I'm going to kind of conclude this session, this lecture, with my quote, is to thrive on the challenge and then celebrate the success. It is so important to keep yourself focused and motivated, especially during this challenging time with the coronavirus. It's an easy time to sit and do nothing, but I promise you, at least in my experience, that if I have something to focus on, that helps alleviate some of that stress. And so you should be using your music or even your studies to help progress yourself and help your mental health. In talking to several of my friends, we've been on a roller coaster during these last 6 weeks. And I've asked some of them, what are you doing, to help you in this time? And a lot of them have said that they've really focused on self-improvement, in reading books, in, like myself, I got out my Baroque oboe, in studying on a topic that maybe, you don't usually have time to really focus on, or getting outside and getting some exercise. That, to me, is one of the most important things you can do. So I hope this lecture helps. As I said, I have another one. I'm working on a little project for myself that I'm going to share with you. But I just really want you to think about practicing carefully, practicing deeply with intention. Thank you.